Yeah. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us for our first NEXIS-X of the semester. A brief plug about Nexis. We are a student group here at the iSchool. We're a project center where undergraduates and graduates can come and work independently on projects on their own, explore stuff outside of the classroom, and learn something new. And NEXIS-X are seminars that we run. We try to do 3 to 4 a semester where a Nexis member talks about something they've worked with, whether it's related directly to their project or a technology they're knowledgeable about, and it's basically just kind of a short seminar. So, and this first one is on web development with React. So, my name is Ceskavich. I am a second-year graduate student here at the iSchool. So, today, it's going to be about an hour-ish. Part 1, quick and dirty web essentials. Just kind of going over the foundation of what is web development, what are the different parts of it that matter for us in our discussion today. Then an introduction to the React framework, which is what we're going to be going over. And then a tutorial, a little example I'm going to go through. Some of you may have seen that I had a boilerplate you could download to follow along. And if you just want to watch, that's cool too. So the web, starting it off. Before we get into that, I'm just interested, raise a show of hands, who here has experience doing any kind of programming, and in regards how about web development specifically? Who has worked with different web frameworks, doing a kind of full stack development before? Anybody? Cool. Okay, so varying interests, that's fine. And the goal of this is to work for everyone, so I just was interested. So there's a lot that goes into web development, especially when you're talking about applications on the web. You'll hear things like back-end, front-end. You'll hear things like APIs and servers. And we're not going to go over all of that today. We're going to go over part of it. And a lot of what we're going to talk about has to do with the view side of web development, which is when you're working with stuff that you interact with on a screen on your web browser or on your mobile phone. And so I like to call these 3 things the 3 pillars of the web view. And so they are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So HTML is structural semantic markup. What that means is you're literally writing words that describe the structure of a page, what goes where, what type of thing it should be. Is it a link or is it a heading, that kind of stuff. CSS stands for cascading style sheets, and it's exactly what that sounds like. It's styles. It's saying how should it look. It's taking the designs that you might make in Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator and turning it into something that you actually see on a web page. And then JavaScript is interactivity. It's a scripting language that was originally developed way back in 1995 in 10 days for Netscape Navigator, and it's since grown to be so much more than that. And so JavaScript adds interactivity. HTML and CSS are static. They just are kind of there. And JavaScript allows you to interact with that and provide an additional sense of richness. And React is written in JavaScript. You write JavaScript to use it, and there are a whole host of JavaScript solutions available today. So some examples. So for those of you not familiar with web development, so this is HTML. This is the structure. HTML is known for these opening and closing tags. The opening tags, the 2 little triangles, and then the closing tag with a slash. And you put things between them, and you can nest things, and you see it's a hierarchy. You have the HTML encapsulating the whole document, and then you have something like a title. H1 is the biggest header. P stands for paragraph, and then we see it rendered down here. Very basic, white background, Times New Roman. There's no styling, but that's the structure. And then we can go into CSS. And this is what some basic CSS looks like. The first one is saying everything within the body tag, give it a font family of Arial. And then the text class, font size, 24 pixels, font style italic, that kind of thing. And so, and we see over here now we have a little styling going on. And then finally, JavaScript. So you can do JavaScript within HTML itself in a script tag, which we have right here. But you can also do it in its own file, and we're going to do that later. And so this is really basic. It's just a function called click me, and it launches an alert. And this button, we've put the click me function up there. And now, this example, I click the button, and I got a little alert. So that's the real basic kind of like essence of those 3 parts of web development and why they matter. And so another part of web development that's pretty important is called the DOM. And you don't always need to know what the DOM is, but it's actually kind of important for React. So I'll touch on this later too. But so the DOM stands for the Document Object Model. And it's a standard and it's a hierarchy of browser elements that your web browser, whatever it may be, manages in the background. And basically HTML is rendered into DOM nodes. You know how we had that little hierarchy, like the body tag with things inside it? DOM is a hierarchy. And basically with HTML, you're saying this is what you should do on the DOM, and then JavaScript manipulates the DOM. That's how you interact with it. It says, you know, add this content here, or launch this alert, that kind of thing. And then finally, frameworks. So what is a framework? Well, they make the web go round. They actually make a lot of things in the world of like programming and stuff like that function. So there's specialized libraries that extend the abilities of a programming language to do something very specific. So programming languages are often described as general purpose, which means they have a lot of standard, very extensible abilities. They'll have like data types and data structures, the ability to write different types of functions, but then that's it. You kind of decide what you do with it. You can do some math, or you can do some analysis on data. And often, when you want to do more complex things like build a web application with JavaScript, you have to write a lot of base code to handle very basic things. And instead of rewriting it every time, people develop frameworks, which are large libraries for these specific purposes. So languages, there's JavaScript, Ruby and Python are 2 other languages that are pretty well known in web development, specifically like back-end stuff on the server. And then frameworks that kind of pair with these languages. React is a JavaScript framework. Ruby on Rails is a Ruby full stack framework. And then Flask is a Python framework. And they are all for different things. React, as we'll see, is very focused on the view, which is what we see and interact with. Ruby on Rails is well known for being incredibly expansive and covering everything from stuff on the view end all the way to the server and how you handle data and all that. And then Flask is kind of somewhere in between. And so now kind of what we're all here for, React, the framework that we're here to discuss. So React is built and maintained by Facebook. And so that means basically every single one of you has probably used React at some point, because the Facebook newsfeed on the web is built in React now. A lot of other companies are using it in production on a daily basis because it is open source. It's pretty hot, as they might say, in the web development world at the moment, which is kind of like why we're here, right? But it's a JavaScript library for building user interfaces. So it's very much focused on what happens on the client, what happens in your view, and all the complexity that goes into there. And there are 3 key ideas, which are virtual DOM, components, and state. So virtual DOM brings it back to our discussion earlier of the document object model. And so React actually manages its own in-memory representation of the DOM, and it uses it to do really cool, speedy changes that we'll get into in a moment. React is also all about these things called components. You can build one giant React app, but the better way of doing it is breaking it down. React helps you think in a way where you break down a web page into little bits and pieces and piece them together. And it's great for a couple reasons. One is it makes it easier to do larger applications. It also enforces this idea of extensibility, where you can easily create components that you reuse in different parts of your web applications instead of having to rewrite them. And then finally, the really cool thing that kind of ties this all together in React is state. So state is data. State is what you see. When you load your newsfeed, everything that's there at the beginning, that's the initial state of the application. You have the certain posts that you get, but then state can change, right? Somebody posts something new and it needs to load into your newsfeed. So the application needs to do something to represent that change of state. It needs to reload your newsfeed or something like that. And often you have to do this manually, but React handles a lot of it for you in some interesting ways, and we're going to get into that. So React components, to dive in a little more and give some visual examples of what this all is. So this is the app that we're going to build today. It's it's a very simple to-do app where we have some initial to-dos and we can add one, we can bold one to say it's like more important than the others. So this is a whole app, right? So you could have the root component, like to-do app, but we could break this down further, right? We could say, well, there's a to-do item list, and that could be its own component that is inside the to-do app component. And then we could also say, well, inside the to-do item list, there are a bunch of to-do item components that we then put into that hierarchy. And then we could even go further and we could say, you know what, let's have an add to-do component. Let's make that its own thing. We're not going to get this far today. We will break it down, but not this much. But it enforces a point where you have the choice of how much you want to break it down. And also, it's helpful. Like, say this to-do app is used in like 5 different places across your larger application. Well, then you can write it once, and then you never need to write it again. You just take the components that you wrote once and use them again because they're extensible. And so that alone makes things a little easier, especially when you're doing larger like production, really expansive stuff. So then also getting into the virtual DOM and state. So this is kind of like what your browser thinks of the DOM in a very simplistic level. It doesn't really care in a lot of cases what the elements are, what the components are. It just sees it as a hierarchy, right? So you have this root thing, which might be your top component, and then you have different elements that branch down in different ways and stuff like that. So that's it. But then something changes. State changes, you have a new post or something, I don't know, somebody adds a to-do. It could be whatever, but your state has changed. And so you need to reflect this. Somehow your application needs to load in this new state and show it to the user in the view. And so traditionally, this could take a lot of work. And so you might have to do a couple things. You might have to refresh the entire DOM to do this, or you might have to manually traverse through the DOM to find that point and actually say, okay, update it with this data. And in larger applications, that can be kind of taxing. The DOM especially is known to be pretty heavy sometimes, and when you're talking about like performance and speed and all this stuff, it can be a lot. And so React is cool because it does it a little differently. First of all, it has this virtual representation, and you don't even need 2 things. One, you don't need to tell it to update. It knows, it watches these things. And 2, it finds only the areas of the DOM that need to be updated and only update that. So not only do you not really have to worry about how to change the state, you just need to say what the state is. It also does it for you in a more efficient way. So before we get into the demo, I know that might have been a lot. It's kind of conceptual. Does anybody have questions or like comments before we dive into the next part?
Can you point out, are there any like websites out there built in React that we would know of?
Yeah, so the Facebook newsfeed is built in React. That's the one I know of the most. There are a lot of websites built in React. If you, I honestly don't have a good list, but you could easily find it if you Google. So React was released in 2013 initially, so it's been 2 years-ish since it's been released, and it really took off since then. It's open source, so anyone can use it for free, so a lot of people do use it in production. And Facebook has been using it since 2011. Their big thing is they always like use their stuff in production for like 2 years before they release it open source, so it's like tried and tested and all that. So a lot of the Facebook app in different like parts of the mobile app and the web app are built in React, so it's all over.
Instagram.com is built in React.
Cool, I didn't know that. Awesome. So yeah, any other questions? Nifty. Okay, so right now we just have this NEXIS-X React to-do app. Cool. So where is that coming from? Well, we see this right here. So this is our initial component. And so the way components work is every single component is encapsulated in this JavaScript class tag, and it extends the React.component class, which gives it a bunch of like inbuilt methods and ways to do different things. And so every component needs a render method, and the render method eventually returns what this component renders in, what the HTML is. And so we give it, inside a div tag, we're giving it the header with NEXIS-X React To-Do app. And then finally, at the very end of your application somewhere, you need to render the entire app in. So you call React, the render method, and you call your base component, that is the top of the hierarchy of components, and you render, and you put in that component, and then you find the part of the page you want to render it into. So I'm going to quickly move over to my HTML, the index page, and you'll see here there's not actually a lot. I only just have this div tag that's empty, but we see here that there's stuff. And so what React does is it actually renders it into the app tag that the ID that we called. And this is a little different than other ways of doing web development. A lot of web applications are built with templates, which a templating system extends the static nature of HTML and allows you to do like dynamic things in it. And React doesn't believe in templates generally. Like, you just don't really use them. The idea behind React is that you bring in the HTML needed into your JavaScript, like so. And finally, one last point, this actually isn't HTML. It just looks like HTML. It's something called JSX. So JSX is an extension on JavaScript that allows you to write what looks like HTML tags that are then compiled down into JavaScript methods. So really, when React processes all of this JavaScript, instead of the div tag, it sees something like this. React create element, you give it the type, and then you give it some information. And the reason we don't really write this is it gets very verbose. You have to chain these together, and it's just a lot easier to use what we already know, which is HTML tags. It's a lot easier to read, especially when you have bigger components. You might have a lot of stuff in here. So, it makes it a little helpful. So now we have, we have our initial thing. And so the first thing we want to do is like, let's see how we'd render in, like let's add in some of the initial to-do items, right? So first I'm going to do this in a very non-React way. And by that I mean I'm going to do it statically. It's just going to write it right in. So we're going to have an unordered list, and then we're going to put in one list item, and I'll say teach this tutorial. And then let's do another one, which is answer questions. So I'm going to save this, refresh, and now we have 2 items in there. So that's cool, like we got that going, but this isn't quite what we want because this is statically built in. These aren't components or anything like that. So next I'm going to take a step back and let's think about the first thing, one of the things that matters in React, which is this idea of state. So rather than render these in statically, let's do it dynamically with managing state. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to add another method to my component constructor. And so this is, this also has some built-in features from React. Oh, whoops. So one thing that you can do in the constructor method in React is you can set the initial state of your application, which can be really complex or not, it depends. So you call the inbuilt state object and you put whatever you want inside of it. So I'm going to put an array of to-dos. So first I'm going to say teach this tutorial, which we had, and I'm going to say answer questions. That's another one. Cool. So now we have our 2 to-do items and they're loaded into state. And so now we can render them dynamically, again, via the state. So the way we do that is we loop through it. So in JSX, if we want to ever put in JavaScript within it, we do these little brackets and then we can put some code in there. So I'm going to say this.state.todos. Map is a function built into all JavaScript arrays that allows us to loop through them. So we're going to get the item and then the index. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say return a list item, and I'm going to say this I'm going to say item, which is the item that we're getting. So if we save this, refresh, same exact thing. We now have are list items that are being rendered in dynamically as part of state. So, so that's the first thing. We have state that is being handled by React and brought into our application. Does that make sense? People still with me here? Cool. Okay, so now let's make this even more like a React app, right? So we talked about our ToDoItem components versus just a list of list items. So let's create a ToDoItem component as well. So I'm gonna go up here and I'm gonna create a new component. I'm gonna call ToDoItem. A note that in production React apps, you often have a component in its own file, and this is split across many different files, and you import components and stuff like that. But we're just gonna do it like this for the sake of today. So we're gonna give it the render method, and so here we're gonna return our list item, and this time we're gonna say this.props.text. And I will explain why we're doing that in a moment. So now let's go back down here, and I forgot to do something here. So first I want to put the encapsulating list tag. And now here, instead of returning a list item, let's return ToDoItem. And then text equals item. So what we've done here now is we're calling our new component and we're giving it a property called text. And then we're accessing that property up here with this.props. So you can pass as many of these named properties as you want to components. And all React components have their own base set of properties accessed by calling this.props. And so now we've given our custom component a custom property called text, which literally has the text of our ToDoItem, and we just access it up here via this.props.text. And so now, if we save this, refresh it, again, looks exactly the same, but it's different now. We have our larger app, but then each of these is its own component. And if we briefly look into the source on the page, you'll see here that all we see is HTML. We don't see any of this like React, like ToDoItem stuff like that. That's because this is becoming HTML. It's being rendered in as standard markup that you would use any day when doing static stuff. But React's handling all that for us. So we got that. We got some cool stuff. So then the last thing we want to do, the last part that we kind of talked about earlier, is change the state, right? We want to add in something new, add in a to-do. So let's do that. So the first thing I'm going to do in preparation is I'm going to add a new field to our state object, which is new to-do. At some point, we're going to need to store the new to-do that we're loading in. So we're going to do that here. And so the next thing down here I'm going to do is I'm going to create, I'm going to add in a new element, and it's going to be input. Input is a standard HTML tag that allows you to manage different types of input fields. And so the type of field I'm going to do is text. And I'm going to give it a value. So the value is always going to correspond to this.state.new-to-do. So to start off with, it's going to be blank because we don't have anything. But if we type in new stuff, it'll be reflected there. And then I'm going to give it an onChange method. So the input tag has a built-in event listener option called onChange. And you can provide it a JavaScript method that does something every single time somebody types a character into this input. And so eventually I'm going to create a method called this.onToDoInput. And I have to bind it, and then that's it. So now let's make this new method that I talked about, or a custom method within our component called onToDoInput. And it's going to take event because the input tag passes it an event object with a lot of information about what's going on when somebody's typing in there. And so we want to change the state. We want to update, when this happens, we want to update new to do, right? So we call React's inbuilt setState method, which allows us to change the initial state. And we're going to say new to do equals event.target.value. And event.target.value is how we access the actual textual value that is being passed into this input tag. So I'm going to add in something right up here quickly to show why this is pretty cool. So, oh, whoops. So what this is going to do is every single time this render method is called, it's going to log the value of new to do to our console. So let's see what happens. So right now we start out and we get this little empty line here that's been logged. And now watch, if we type in, see how we're getting all these logs? So literally what is happening here is every time I type into this method is being called, which is updating our initial state. And React automatically notices that some part of the state within this render method has changed, so it calls it again. And instead of us having to manually do that, it just automatically does it for us. And so that's cool, that's nice, but we don't really see anything, right? We're just typing into a form field. Let's actually do what we came here to do, which is add a new to-do to our to-do list. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to get rid of this annoying log. And so now we need to add it. So let's add a button to handle the actual click. So we're going to say button, and we're going to say add to do. And now this button is going to need a method. Similar to how the input needed an onChange method. Here we're going to need an onClick method. I'm going to say add new to do. So now down here, I'm going to add that new method. So add new to do, and it's going to have to do two things. One is it's going to have to add the value of new to do into our array of actual to dos, and it's going to have to reset the value of new to do because we don't have a new to do anymore. We've added it in. So we're going to call our set state method again, and we're going to do two things. One is to dos. We're going to do this dot state dot to dos dot concat. And then we're going to do this state.new to do. So this is a way of doing that. It's basically saying take our array of to-dos and add the new to-do into it and set that as our actual array of to-dos. And then after that, we also want to be like, also, let's make our new to-do, let's reset it to nothing, right? It's an empty string now. You don't need anything. So we have our button. It has an onClick method that will supposedly add it. So let's go finish the tutorial. And then I'm going to go and add it. And there we go.